JavaScript is always available. That's not true either. A lot of people like to think that, well, hey, this is Web 2.0, this is 2010, everybody has JavaScript, but it's just not true. And we'll talk a little bit about these two things more in the presentation. Screen readers don't support JavaScript, and we also saw that that is not true. A lot of developers are in the mindset that, if we need to make it accessible, they just don't take this use case into account. They assume that screen reader users don't have JavaScript, where the opposite is actually true. Most screen reader users have JavaScript enabled. And then the last one, making it accessible is too difficult. And that's just not true either. It's just a slightly different way of doing things. So what are some of the key issues with JavaScript and accessibility? I think I've nailed it down to these four, maybe the largest issues. Keyboard access, the content changes, appropriate usage, and JavaScript being unavailable. So, as we heard earlier, keyboard access is very important. Obviously, if you don't have a mouse, you could be using a keyboard, and if you can't access everything with the keyboard, then it's not accessible. But a lot of other assistive technologies rely on keyboard-like emulators or input devices. So it's very important that everything is keyboard accessible. Here's some examples of some assistive technologies. Alternative keyboards, head wands, trackballs. And here's a few pictures. If you haven't seen any of this kind of stuff, there's a nice picture of an alternative keyboard. So it's basically the same as a regular keyboard, except the keys are a little bigger, and there may be a few fewer keys. And it's just easier for people who may be mobile impaired, to use. So the following screenshot will show you an example of core functionality that is not available with the keyboard. So this is Twitter.com, and so almost a year and a half ago, this is pretty much the spark for creating accessible Twitter.com. And there was actually Gaz Lemon created a monkey script to fix this particular issue. But the issue is if you tap through and you come here, nothing appears. And if you know Twitter.com fairly well, you'll know that you're supposed to be able to favorite a tweet or reply to a tweet or delete your own tweet. And unfortunately, if you're not using a mouse, you won't be able to. So I have another example. It shows links that can be accessed by a keyboard, but you wouldn't even know it. Well, at least the sighted user wouldn't know it. And this has been an example for a while now, and CNN still hasn't addressed this issue. But, visually, here's the CNN homepage, and I've actually tabbed to a particular main menu issue with that is, it's not fully supported by browsers and screen readers, and well, that's the main reason, I guess. But another thing, a trend that's coming kind of a convention, at least for sighted users, is you could, when some content updates, you could do like this yellow flash, like this yellow gradient background flash. So for sighted users, that's easy to see and recognizable that something's happening in that area of the page. And another method, an oldie, but I think it's still a goodie, is the trusty JavaScript alert. Some of you may be cringing, but I still use that once in a while. So here's a screenshot of accessible Twitter, and in accessible Twitter there is ARIA markup, but there are a few places where I still use the JavaScript alerts. So here I'm on a user details page, and I click the follow link to follow this user, and so Ajax runs, and when it completes, it gives this JavaScript alert notifying the user, cited or not cited, that success, you are now following web apps account. So it gives feedback and lets you know what happened. So the not following text actually had changed in this area here. It had changed to following. But in case you didn't see it or you can't see it, this JavaScript alert notifies the user. Okay, appropriate usage. Now, what I mean by that is you should only use JavaScript when necessary. And nowadays, that's usually most of the time, or at least to make all the really cool interactive stuff, people might say it's quote-unquote necessary. But also, remember, you should be using it to enhance the behavior. Not to use it for the core behavior, but only to enhance the behavior. So, here's an example I blogged about last week, and I blogged about California.ca.gov's accessibility page, and they actually ended up updating that page a few days later, which was pretty cool. But one of the issues I rose was these the breadcrumbs, which are a great idea. But there's a few flaws in the way they've implemented it. And one of the flaws is that it uses JavaScript to create the breadcrumbs when, I'm not sure why they did that. It's just static content tags that could be done just manually typed in, or it could be done with server-side solution. Probably be the best way to do that. That way you can just avoid JavaScript altogether. Okay, I'm back to the unavailable part. Surprise, some users may not have JavaScript available in their browser or their user agent. And they say it's approximately 4% of users, but the numbers are really difficult to track. So if you don't believe me, then we could go through the next slide. Some of the reasons people might not have JavaScript enabled is because they might be on some kind of mobile device or some kind of user agent like a Kindle that might not support JavaScript. They could have an old browser and for some reason or another not be able to upgrade. Blind users who can't afford the expensive Java screen reader or another screen reader that supports JavaScript, they might not have it enabled. For corporate users, if there's a firewall in some corporations, they block JavaScript for security reasons. Or just those who are concerned about security or speed or just personal preference, they don't like some of the enhancements that JavaScript is giving them, they turn it off. My dad actually does that because he's kind of paranoid going out on the web, so he actually turns off his JavaScript. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't use JavaScript. I think JavaScript is great. I'm not saying you shouldn't use it. I'm saying when you use it, you should do it to enhance the experience and progressive enhancement. This is one of the, maybe the biggest, let's see, what do you call it? Methods. The most important methods in web accessibility in JavaScript. So, who knows what progressive enhancement is? Okay, about half, I suppose. Basically, it's the opposite of graceful degradation. So, you want to start with your basic content and start with your basic functionality, build it in with server-side technologies, your nice posh, your plain old semantic HTML, and then you're going to build upon that after that. So, progressive enhancement is layering, it's progressively enhancing the experience. And you can do that with JavaScript, but you can also do that with other things like CSS3. And a good quote to remember is plan for Ajax from the start and implement Ajax at the end. Once you've built everything nice and semantically with server-side scripting, it's a snap to just reuse some of that code and implement the Ajax. So here kind of is more of a visual explanation. We have an M&M peanut. And the peanut in the center is kind of like the content. And the presentation is the chocolate coating. And then the nice candy shell is the real cool JavaScript interactive client-side scripting stuff. I didn't create this myself. I took this from an article that I referenced at the end. So that's basically what Dirk would have told you is the 3 pillars or the 5 pillars of web standards and accessibility is the 3 pillars are the content, the HTML, the presentation, the CSS, and the behavior, the JavaScript. So progressive enhancements, you're using the web standards and you're separating those 3 things. Okay, so here's some of the core principles of progressive enhancement. And I got this off of Wikipedia, which the article there is actually really good. But the one to take home with you, at least for this presentation, is about the JavaScript. Enhanced behavior is provided by unobtrusive, externally linked JavaScript. Who knows what unobtrusive means? So unobtrusive just means you don't put the JavaScript inline in the HTML. You want to keep it separate. So put it in the header of your document or external. Same with the CSS. Not only is that better all around, but then it's easier for you to manage and maintain. Okay, so here's my accessibletwitter.com homepage. And it looks pretty good. You got your main menu. Here's where you enter your status. Here's a field to shorten a URL. Here's a field to add an image. And this is all non-JavaScript. So if you add in the JavaScript, it looks like this. Slightly